There are moments when forgiveness is expected and you feel yourself slow down instead. An apology arrives, a gesture is made, time has passed. From the outside, it looks like the moment to let go. But inside, nothing opens. You hear the words clearly. You understand what is being offered. You don't deny that something happened. You simply don't release it. The memory stays where it is, intact, unsoftened by time or explanation. This doesn't always feel dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet. You continue interacting. You remain civil. You don't bring the past into every conversation. But it hasn't disappeared. It hasn't dissolved into something neutral. It's still there, informing how close you stand, how much you trust, how much you allow. People often assume forgiveness is a switch, that once enough time passes, the feeling should change. That understanding should lead naturally to release. When it doesn't, they may start to ask questions, gently at first, then with confusion, then with pressure. Inside, the experience is simpler than it looks. You remember, not obsessively, not with constant anger, just clearly. The memory hasn't been rewritten. It hasn't been transformed into a lesson or a story with a clean ending. It remains what it was. You might notice how often forgiveness is framed as something you owe, as maturity, as growth, as proof that you've moved on. When you don't offer it easily, people may assume you're stuck, or bitter, or unwilling to heal. Those interpretations hover around you, even if no one says them out loud. But from your side, it doesn't feel like being stuck. It feels like accuracy, like not pretending something no longer matters when it still does. You're not holding on to the memory to punish anyone. You're holding it because it hasn't changed shape. There are moments when this feels heavy, when you wonder if remembering costs you something, when you notice how easily others forgive and forget, how quickly they restore closeness. You see that ease, and you recognize that you don't have it. Other times, remembering feels grounding, protective, like refusing to erase information your mind considers important. The memory doesn't demand action. It doesn't ask for revenge. It simply asks not to be dismissed. You may not speak about this openly. Forgiveness is praised. Remembering is not. So you keep it internal. You adjust quietly. You choose distance where closeness once existed. You remain polite. You remain calm. Forgiveness is offered around you as a solution. You don't reject it loudly. You just don't take it. And what remains is not hostility, but a clear awareness of what happened, carried forward without drama. You remember. And for now, that feels more honest than letting go. Jung would look at remembering instead of forgiving and ask what the memory is doing inside the psyche. Not whether it is justified and not whether it should be released, but why it remains active. For him, what stays is rarely accidental. He would say that memory persists when it still carries meaning. Not intellectual meaning, but psychic weight. Something in the experience has not been integrated, not because the person is unwilling, but because the psyche does not yet consider it complete. Forgiveness, in this sense, is not a moral act. It is an internal reorganization. And not everything reorganizes on command. Jung would notice that people who don't forgive easily are often deeply attentive to inner truth. They are not trying to punish. They are not rehearsing the past for pleasure. They are simply refusing to falsify their inner record. The memory remains because it has not been transformed into something else. It has not softened into a symbol. It is still concrete. From this lens, remembering can be a form of protection. The psyche keeps certain memories alive because they contain information about boundaries, about trust, about vulnerability. Letting go too quickly can feel like erasing data that was costly to acquire. Jung would also point to the role of the shadow. Forgiveness is socially praised. Remembering is often judged, so the refusal to forgive easily may be pushed into the shadow, framed as bitterness or stubbornness. But what is disowned by the collective often returns as inner insistence. The psyche resists being forced into a narrative that doesn't match its lived reality. He would distinguish remembering from rumination. Remembering is stable. It does not loop endlessly. It sits. It informs. Rumination agitates. It seeks resolution through repetition. The person who remembers instead of forgives is often not consumed by the past. They simply have not erased it. Jung would say that true integration does not come from deciding to forgive. It comes when the meaning of the experience changes, when the wound becomes knowledge rather than injury. That process cannot be rushed. It unfolds at its own pace, or not at all. There is also identity here. Some people learn who they are through continuity, through keeping track of what has happened to them. Forgiveness can feel like a break in that continuity, like pretending the past no longer informs the present. For certain psyches, that feels dishonest. Jung would not encourage holding on forever, but he would resist the idea that release is always healthy. Sometimes the psyche needs to remember in order to remain whole. Sometimes forgetting is not healing, but fragmentation. From his view, remembering instead of forgiving is not a failure of growth. It can be a sign that something is still alive inside, still being worked with. The psyche is saying, not yet. Not because it refuses peace, but because it refuses distortion. And until that inner alignment occurs, the memory stays. Quietly. Precisely. Doing the work forgiveness cannot yet do. Nietzsche would be suspicious of how easily forgiveness is praised. Not because forgiveness is false, but because it is often demanded. He would notice how quickly remembering is framed as a flaw and how readily letting go is treated as virtue. For him, this reveals more about social comfort than moral truth. From Nietzsche's view, forgiveness often serves the one who benefits from forgetting. It smooths tension. It restores order. It allows things to continue without reckoning. When someone does not forgive easily, it interrupts that flow. The past does not dissolve on schedule. The injury remains present, not loudly, but firmly. Nietzsche would recognize this as a refusal to falsify experience. To forgive too quickly can mean rewriting what happened so that it fits a story of progress or maturity. Remembering instead is a way of saying, this mattered, this changed something, and I will not pretend otherwise. He was deeply interested in memory as a form of strength, not nostalgia, not grievance, but the capacity to hold on to what has shaped you without needing it to resolve neatly. Forgetting can be a relief, but it can also be a kind of obedience, a way of aligning with what others find easier to live with. Nietzsche would also point to resentment here, but not in the way it is usually used. He would not accuse the person who remembers of being bitter by default. Instead, he would ask whether the memory still holds power because it was never acknowledged properly. Not forgiven, but not recognized either. In this lens, forgiveness can become a moral shortcut, a way to bypass discomfort. Remembering instead keeps the tension alive, not to punish, but to preserve truth. The person is not clinging to the past. They are refusing to lie about it. Nietzsche would notice how unsettling this is for others. A person who remembers cannot be easily reassured. They do not accept explanations as closure. They do not exchange memory for peace. This makes them difficult to manage. Not aggressive, just unmovable. He would say that remembering is not passive, it is an active stance. It says that time alone does not erase meaning, that harm does not become harmless just because it is old, that some things leave marks that deserve to remain visible. This does not make remembering noble by default. Nietzsche never romanticized suffering, but he did respect honesty. And there is honesty in refusing to call something healed when it is merely quiet. From his perspective, the person who does not forgive easily is not trapped in the past. They are standing in it, fully aware, without needing it to justify itself. They are not seeking revenge. They are seeking coherence. Forgiveness, when it comes, must come from transformation, not pressure, not expectation. Until then, remembering is not weakness. It is clarity that refuses consolation. And for Nietzsche, that refusal carries its own kind of strength. Arendt would look at remembering instead of forgiving and immediately notice the tension it creates in shared life. Forgiveness, for her, is not only personal. It has a social function. It allows relationships to reset. It permits action to continue without being indefinitely bound to the past. When forgiveness does not arrive, something in the public space slows down. She would observe how strongly forgiveness is expected, not because people are malicious, but because social worlds depend on continuity. Conversations, collaborations, families, institutions all rely on the ability to begin again. Forgiveness makes new beginnings possible. Remembering, when it resists that reset, interrupts the flow. From Arendt's view, this interruption is unsettling precisely because it is quiet. The person who remembers does not necessarily accuse or demand. They may continue to show up. They may remain civil. But the past is not neutralized. It remains present in how closeness is measured, how trust is granted, how much access is allowed. This creates ambiguity. Others are unsure how to place the relationship. Has it moved on or hasn't it? Is the past over or still operative? Arendt was deeply interested in how uncertainty destabilizes public life. Forgiveness offers clarity. Remembering preserves complexity. She would notice how quickly remembering is reframed as a problem. Not forgiving easily is often described as holding a grudge, being stuck, or refusing peace. These labels serve a purpose. They push the responsibility for discomfort onto the one who remembers rather than onto the unresolved event itself. Arendt would say that this is how social pressure operates, not through force, but through expectation. Forgiveness becomes a norm. Remembering becomes a deviation. The person who does not forgive easily is subtly asked to explain themselves, even if no one says it directly. What makes this especially difficult is that remembrance does not always come with action. There may be no confrontation to respond to, no demand to negotiate, just a boundary that remains in place. Arendt understood that public life is structured around speech and action. When neither is offered, the space becomes harder to manage. She would also point out that forgiveness is often framed as generosity, as something that restores harmony. Remembering, by contrast, is framed as withdrawal. But withdrawal is not the same as refusal. The person who remembers may not be rejecting others. They may simply be declining to erase history. From Arendt's perspective, this choice has consequences. Relationships may not collapse, but they change shape. Certain conversations stop happening. Certain roles are no longer available. Trust becomes conditional. Not as punishment, but as recalibration. She would not moralize this. Arendt was careful not to turn observation into instruction. She would simply note that forgiveness enables collective life to move forward more easily. Remembering insists that movement carry its weight. In this sense, remembering instead of forgiving is not an act against others. It is an act that resists simplification. It refuses to compress the past into something manageable for the present. And that refusal, while quiet, leaves a mark on the shared space. Camus would recognize remembering instead of forgiving as a quiet refusal that doesn't ask to be understood. Not a protest, not a demand, just a decision to stop forcing resolution where none has naturally formed. For him, forgiveness is often treated as a moral endpoint, something you arrive at to prove growth, wisdom, or peace. But Camus was wary of endings that arrive too neatly. He understood that some experiences do not resolve, they don't transform into lessons, they simply remain part of the landscape of a life. From this lens, remembering is not clinging, it is staying faithful to what happened. The person is not reliving the past over and over. They are not consumed by it. They are simply refusing to pretend that time alone has changed its meaning. Camus would say that forgiveness, when it is demanded, can become a kind of false reconciliation, a way of smoothing over discomfort so life can continue without interruption. Remembering resists that smoothness. It keeps the rough edge visible, not to punish, but to remain honest. There is dignity in that honesty. The person who does not forgive easily is not staging a moral stand. They are not trying to appear strong. They are simply choosing not to perform emotional closure for the comfort of others. Camus was interested in how people live without guarantees, without final answers. Remembering instead of forgiving fits this condition. It accepts that some wounds do not become wisdom. Some losses do not become clarity. Some betrayals do not become neutral with time. This doesn't mean the person is trapped. Life continues, relationships adjust. Distance is recalibrated. The memory does not dominate every moment. It simply exists, quietly shaping what feels possible and what does not. From Camus' view, this is not bitterness. Bitterness demands compensation. Remembering does not. It asks nothing. It simply remains. He would also note the loneliness of this position. Forgiveness often restores harmony. Remembering can keep things slightly unresolved. Conversations stay polite. Closeness stays measured. The person accepts this without dramatizing it. In the end, Camus would not tell the viewer to forgive or not forgive. He would resist turning this into instruction. He would simply recognize a truth that many live with silently. Some people do not release easily, not because they want to hold pain, but because they refuse to lie about what still matters. And they carry that memory forward, not loudly, not bitterly, but intact.